The leader of the India practice of McKinsey Company Inc. Adil, can we have you on stage, please? Welcome. I'd like to invite Mr. Laxman Narasimhan, Director, New Delhi, McKinsey Company Inc., who currently leads the marketing and sales, consumer retail and media practices in India. And Mr. Koichi Yamamoto, General Manager, Global Solutions Center, Dentsu, Japanese #1 advertising and creative services. Adil, can I hand it over to you, please? There's the microphone. Come.
Thank you.
All yours. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon or good morning. I'm just going to start out by giving you a very brief overview along the theme of uncertainty is the new certainty. And it's based on some work that we've been doing from McKinsey Global Institute. As the economies began to unravel in 2008, a lot of people asked us for predictions on what would happen. And as we went into it in a lot of detail, we realized that, in fact, it is impossible to predict what would happen. So I want to show you some data on that and just give you a sense for how we are thinking about how the world is likely to evolve from an economic standpoint, which would affect, obviously, many things for both marketing and ad agencies and others. So I'll just give you a very quick overview of that, and then I will turn it over to Laxman, who will talk about marketing in 4 dimensions in the context of this new world that we are seeing in terms of the uncertainty. So can I go to the first slide, please? Can I go to the next slide? Sorry, I am? Okay. All right. There we go. Sorry. Thank you. So I apologize that in this wonderful audience that loves music, dance, film stars, and wonderful ads, I have to bring you back to some fundamental statistics. But hopefully it will at least set the tone. So in terms of rebalancing, and I apologize for this chart, but that's the simplest way to explain it, is we tried to develop 4 scenarios of how the world is going to evolve over the next few years economically. Okay? And roughly speaking, green is good, red is bad. On the x-axis, it's whether emerging markets will remain very strong or not, and whether developed markets will remain strong or not. And we wanted some 4 simple scenarios, and then we polled a very large number of executives and government executives, central bankers around the world to understand what they thought would occur. So let me just take you through the 4 quick scenarios. We would all love to have this. The world is rebalanced. We forget 2008, and there are no major crises. The world goes back to its original growth rate. In fact, if this happens, the GDP of the world is 77.6 trillion. 2 greens, developing world does well, and emerging markets stay strong. Okay? We would all love to have this. I'll tell you what % of us believe that this will be the case. A second scenario is that, in fact, emerging markets get derailed. For a variety of reasons, the growth is too fast, but that, in fact, the developed markets come back on a growth track. That's scenario 2. If that happens, the GDP of the world is around 65 trillion. Scenario 3 is the decade of the dragon and tiger that many people have been talking about, which is who cares what happens in the developed world, but the developing markets just keep performing pretty well, and that it continues. And the 4th is chaos. That is, globalization is just stalled, and in fact, both developing markets as well as developed markets go badly. Okay? So those are roughly the 4 scenarios. The reason we did this, as I said, is to get a sense for how people are thinking and how quickly things change in terms of their views about what is likely to happen. So before I show you what 1,500 senior executives and government officials thought at different points in time, I'd like you to think in your mind about which scenarios likely to occur if you had to choose one, and what probabilities would you assign to the 4 scenarios, okay? So just think in your minds, and then we will judge whether or not you are thinking the way a large number of economic thinkers are, or people, participants in the economy are thinking, okay? Enough time, understood, or you don't care, or whatever? All right. Okay, so scenario 1, the world rebalanced. It's quite interesting to see how it is also changing over time. In March of this year, 20% of all, I think this is a panel of something like 2,000 senior executives and government officials thought we would go back to scenario 1 and all would be wonderful. In September, you can see a slight decline in terms of the people who are the true optimists. If you look at scenario 2, which is emerging markets will derail, roughly speaking, fewer people now actually think that's going to happen compared to 6 months before. And in 6 months is a very short period of time to have major changes of that type. I think a large number of people feel that, in fact, the decade of the dragon and tiger will continue, which is emerging markets are in reasonable shape, independent of what happens to developed markets. And I think the most interesting one is the globalization stalled scenario. Actually, people had started becoming more confident about it. And just in September, October, as we watched the Euro crisis unveil, I think a greater number of people have started thinking that that'll happen. Now, when we did this in the early 90s and other times, actually you would see a solid consensus emerge on one of these scenarios. And I think part of the reason of the new uncertainty is even the folks who are in fact setting guidelines for economic policy around the world and executives are having a very difficult time agreeing on what is likely to happen. And in fact, their mood about what is likely to happen is changing relatively rapidly. So, the good news is you could look at this and say that in scenario 1 and 3 combined, 50 to 57% or 59% of people believe emerging markets are fine. They will do okay, right? And 41% think that they won't do so well. And so that's a pretty positive sign on emerging markets. On the other hand, it is actually worrying that, almost 40% of the folks think, in fact, that developed markets will not do well. 70% actually will not do well, and that has gone up by about 7 or 8 points compared to just a few months ago. I raise this because any measure, any index you measure in terms of volatility of economic performance, volatility of currencies, volatility of prices of commodities and others, is in a sense at a substantially higher level than it was many years ago. While it varies month to month, it will remain high, and I think our expectation is that for the next few years, we will be in this period of uncertainty where people will change their minds relatively quickly about which direction things are going in. Okay. So I just wanted to put that as just a little bit of background, just so that people can keep that in mind as we go forward. I'm just going to skip a couple of things that many speakers have talked about before, and I just want to go back to the 3 or 4 forces that are driving this. And I won't talk about the great rebalancing in terms of emerging markets because you know about that. But I would like to talk about 3 other things. Number 1, the global grid. Independent of everything that we hear about globalization, from a financial standpoint and a trade standpoint, the countries around the world are linked into a global grid. The pace at which financial flows have grown in the last 10 years and continue to grow is much faster than trade, of course, almost 2 times trade, but it is still growing, and it will continue to grow. So we are not seeing a fallback to countries becoming individual islands under any shape that we've seen 30, 40 years ago. We are going to be linked into a global grid, and it'll be even faster. With all the new technologies of Facebook, Twitter, and others, nobody talks about countries anymore. Almost there's instantaneous flow of information. So the information flows even faster. I just want to highlight number 4 and 5, which we've not talked about. Under any circumstances, all natural resources, I think Harish talked about food, but you can talk about water, or more importantly, about oil, zinc, copper, aluminum, iron ore. Every one of those commodities is under stress in terms of supply versus demand imbalances. It is more difficult to find them. The new places where you find them are more expensive. And if you believe that the emerging world will continue to grow at the rate we talked about earlier, then there will be a huge stress on it for the next 5 to 10 years. Okay? And so pricing the planet will become a very big deal. And the fifth one, which I just want to talk about, is the emerging and extended role of the state in the market. We used to always talk about the fact that there are countries where the government does not intervene in markets and are broadly free market, and countries where they do intervene. I think across the board, as a result of the crises that occurred, as a result of the social goals that we're looking at, as a result of sustainability, environment, etc., we will expect that over the next 5 years, the state will play, in fact, a much greater role in the market. And whether we like it or not, there will be more regulations around everything. I would not be surprised if there are more regulations in and around media, but there will certainly be more regulations around what companies do, what you can do. And of course, those of us who live in India are, of course, used to having lots of regulation. But I think across the board, this is one of the big trends that we will see in terms of the state intervening in the markets across almost every market. With that as background, I'm going to turn it over now to Laxman, who will talk about the new consumer. Thank you.
Thank you, Adil. Thank you, Adil.